What is up, everybody? Welcome back to League Unlock. My name is Eric, and it's about time. It is about that time to preview the playoffs in the LEC. I guess technically we're talking about round one because it's not as simple and clear-cut as quarterfinals, semis, finals anymore with their new format, so we're going to call them round one of the LEC playoffs. And as you know, Fnatic, because they finished that top seed that didn't have a bye, so in at number 3, they got to pick their opponent. They chose Vitality over SK Gaming, probably due to the fact that they went 0-3 against SK in the regular season. But their matchups against Vitality in the regular season were not so great either. The head-to-head that these guys had, they played in some insane matchups. But when you look at the numbers between these two squads, they are very similar. They're both very indicative of where they finished in that regular season. Obviously, they were 3-5. So, well, Fnatic, I mean, they just locked it up. We finished top 3 in all these categories. The goal differential at 15, Baron percentage, and that's the team KDA, or team kill to death ratio. And for Fnatic, the fact that they're finishing top 3 in all these categories after the abysmal start that they had is actually insanely impressive because they were bottom 3, bottom 2 for the majority of stats leading into week 6 maybe. So good for them for bouncing back, but obviously the early game is where they have been steamrolling through teams these last 4 weeks, and that's usually the strong suit for Vitality, so it's interesting to see how these games are going to play off, and there's going to be huge implications when it comes to that laning phase because you know both of these teams know how to snowball a lead. Fnatic probably better at playing from behind, as we've seen Vitality struggle mightily in that regard. But you remember the first time these guys matched up, and it was a pretty clear stomp. I don't want to say stomp in the favor of Vitality, but they clearly ran away with it in the second half of that game. That was when Fnatic got put to 0-3. And the second time these guys matched up, which was much more recently, the last couple of weeks, I think it was week 8 that they matched up, or no, week 7. And I mean, this was a tough game for Fnatic. It was the beginning of all the must-win games for them, and it was back and forth. It had some insane moments. You had, of course, this Elder Dragon steal on the Tom Kench tongue from Jack Troll that looked like it should have been the game ender for Vitality. And then obviously you had a couple of picks for Fnatic. Then they go march down 5v3, 5v4 and turn around one last team fight in the Vitality base. But these games were very volatile, very back and forth. And so even though I think Vitality and SK were both two tough matchups for Fnatic to pick coming into this one because I think they struggled against both of them. SK obviously more so than Vitality, which is why they decided to pick Vitality, I'm sure. And now it's looking better, especially because SK ended week 9 with a 3-0 run to clinch a playoff spot, so they got momentum going with them. And Vitality obviously 0-2 with some very underwhelming games, especially getting completely stomped by that same SK Gaming. So you can see why Fnatic decided to choose Vitality. They've also played them in best of 5s before in 2018 where they got the better of them. So I think they're happy with their matchup, and I think Fnatic, I think they would come in as big favorites against pretty much anyone. Even G2 or Origin, I feel like Fnatic would be favorites if they matched up directly against them. But Vitality, I think they're going to be big favorites in this matchup. And the main spot you want to be checking out, I think you can say top lane, the advantage goes the way of Cabochard against Whippo. Jungle, you're going with Broxa. But the mid lane is where things are really gonna go down for this key matchup, because bot lane I think is a big advantage for Fnatic, but you would say mid lane, Jizuke versus Nemesis, probably the edge goes to Jizuke maybe, but I mean, we had Nemesis as an all-pro mid laner. The LEC, the actual awards, went to Jizuke in that mid lane, and his numbers underwhelming in this split, and we know that he is prone to, you know, some ISO deaths or getting caught out in scenarios where you wouldn't expect. But you remember, just last year, Jizuke was the standout rookie and the rookie of the split in Europe. Now, Nemesis, he's not going to get that award this year, but he was a standout rookie amongst many other guys here in EU that really started performing well. But you've got to expect Broxah and Mowgli to both be sitting in the mid lane for this matchup because, I mean, Hylissang and Reckless, I don't think they need assistance in that bottom lane, and you know Mowgli wants to get some action going in that mid lane. And there were some fun matchups. You remember Nemesis getting a solo kill. The casters absolutely lost their minds on that play, even though he was already down 30 CS. But there was actually a nice back and forth between Nemesis and Jizuke taking over some of these team fights in both of their previous matchups. So I think a lot of the early game is going to run through that mid lane. We know it's very opposite playstyles. Jizuke is insanely aggressive, and Nemesis, you saw him with the top KDA among mid laners. He's a lot more passive. He's a lot more calculated about when he's going to all in or when he's going to be playing aggressive. So Jizuke is just going to run it down on him and either get a huge snowball going or maybe a serious deficit. So I expect Mowgli and Broxah to both be spending a lot of time in that mid lane, and I think whoever wins that matchup, that's the one that's gonna kind of sway these laning phases, because Cabo gets the advantage in the top lane, and Reckless and Hylissang, I think, have a bigger advantage than Cabo has against Bwipo in that bottom lane. So maybe Broxah goes there as well, but you expect him to be camping that mid lane a lot as well. But the main win condition, I think, for Vitality, because Fnatic, if they play as they've played lately, they're going to win this series pretty easily, I would say. I give this still heavily favored to Fnatic. I might go 80-20 in favor of Fnatic. And for Vitality, what they got to do is they got to hope that Jizuke pulls out some crazy picks, because I think the one way they could maybe win this series is, you know, he's busting out the Echo, the Fizz, forcing out some odd bans that you wouldn't usually ban against Fnatic, and maybe they get trapped into some uncomfortable drafts, and Vitality are able to pick up some power picks across the board the other way. But if things go normally without some insane picks, I feel like this is an easy win for Fnatic. It would be easy to say 3-1, but I think it might be 3-0 for Fnatic. Clean, cool, and calculated for them, because they have looked far and away like the best team in Europe the last couple of weeks. Vitality, I mean, these teams had totally opposite splits. Vitality started great and then fell down, and we know how Fnatic started off this split. So I think Reckless and Hylissang, the biggest mismatch will be in that bottom lane, where they will dominate. Bwipo, I think he'll hold his own against Cabo, which has been the biggest strength and biggest boon for Vitality as of late, and it's not going to be as big against Fnatic. So I'm predicting 3-0 for Fnatic. They look like the much stronger team right now. Coming up after the break, we preview the other series in the LEC, SK versus Splyce. No one expected SK to be here. How far can they go? Howdy doodle, everybody. Welcome back to League Unlock. My name is Eric, and we are previewing the LEC playoff round 1. Second matchup is Splyce versus SK, which I think is much closer than we're going to get for the Fnatic and Vitality matchup. Both of these guys, both these squads look good coming into the playoffs. They were both riding momentum. Splyce had that one loss to Fnatic, but I mean, everyone was losing to Fnatic in the second half of the split, and SK obviously went 3-0 in that tiebreaker to clinch the final spot, and they've looked decent. They've been in a lot of their games this split. Obviously a huge surprise season for them. And these two teams in particular, when they matched up in the regular season, actually had some very exciting games. Some similar numbers. I mean, the first blood numbers are the ones that stand out. Obviously, Xerxes is an absolute menace in that early game, and SK, I mean, who cares about First Blood? They're controlling most of the Barons because Selfmade is a smite god, and the kill death is pretty terrible for SK. It was only better than Rogue, which is not a feather in your cap that you want to be talking about, whereas Splyce there at 4th, so much more controlled, and I think SK, they would stomp games sometimes and get stomped in other ones where they were way down in kills. But the regular season matchups, you remember the first time that they met was this Xin Zhao game where Selfmade had 29% of the team's damage, or something absolutely disgusting for a jungler. Both games they played were very close and very back and forth. kind of like the Fnatic and Vitality matchups, it was Splyce that came out ahead in these matchups, but I mean, they were close, and SK definitely had a chance to win these games. They were, they had some very highlight moments, some good moments, but there was a lot of kills in these games, and more often than not, it was Kobbe popping off to close some of these games out. Obviously, when he's playing the Vayne, it's going to be a late game menace where he's going to take over. But by the way, I want to talk a champion that's going to be very important in this series, I think, is going to be the Jinx, because we've seen her getting picked up a whole lot more this patch across a bunch of different regions. I think it fits the playstyle of both Crownshot and Kobbe. That's one of the interesting matchups in this set, is both teams like to put their AD carries on those hyper-scaling champions, and Crownshot in particular on that Jinx. 3-0 this split with a 12.6 KDA, so he is a beast on that champion, and we know Kobbe is capable of playing it as well. So I expect her to be going through the pick and ban phase quite a bit in this best-of-5 set, as well as the Vayne. We haven't really seen Crownshot pick it up yet, but you got to be banning that against Splyce, because it was Xerxes himself who says, 35 minutes, we're the best team. No one can beat us if we get there. And if you're 35 minutes north of that with a Vayne, you're probably having a good chance of winning that matchup. As we go lane by lane, top lane, I think Vizicsacsi gets the edge against Werlib, and obviously the most exciting matchup comes in that jungle with Xerxes and Selfmade. I mean, both those guys are just the absolute leaders when it comes to the early game. Selfmade is the clear front runner for Rookie of the Split, an all-pro jungler. Xerxes, I'm just going to say he should be an all-pro jungler. He's at the level of one. There were just 3 other junglers who were also at that level, but both these guys had some insane early game numbers. Everything that their team does is run through them. Selfmade had the most player of the game honors in the entire split. So whoever comes out ahead in these early games, and I fully expect both of them to come out ahead in some of these games. I mean, it's going to go very back and forth. I think we'll see some interesting picks in the jungle. I don't want to see Selfmade on Skarner, that's for sure. I want him on these more hyperactive early game junglers where he can completely take over and put out some damage. Same thing with Xerxes. I think both these guys, there's a good chance we see some interesting picks. I'm still waiting for Hecarim. Hecarim top has been dominating solo queue. Xerxes will be the guy to bust out that Hecarim in the jungle. So expecting some spicy picks out of there. And in their earlier matchups, Selfmade and Xerxes themselves had some insane back-to-backs. They had some crazy smite fights over the Baron. Both of them got things rolling in a lot of the early game for both of these matchups. So really excited to see this matchup. It's going to be the main one that's going to dictate how these early games go, because I think that's your main win condition in this series if your SK is getting a big enough gold lead in the early game that you can take over, because we've seen Splyce take down the best of the best in the late game in the LEC. Once it gets 35 minutes, I mean, Xerxes is right. They're hard to beat at that point. I don't think SK has the team to be able to do that, so it's going to be all about snowballing a big enough lead in this early game for SK to come away with the series win, and that's the exact opposite as the win condition for Splyce. Survive the early game, get to the late game. Their average game time is 2 full minutes longer than anyone else in the LEC, so very opposite win conditions for this squad here, and a lot of that is going to come down to the junglers. I might give a slight edge to Selfmade just because we've seen him carry this team so many times, but that's a close matchup in the jungle. The mid lane, I'm giving the advantage to Nemesis there, and that's going to be key for SK, is having Pyrion try and neutralize him. I think the emphasis, much like Fnatic Vitality, should be on that mid lane, because if you want to get the early game rolling, it's going to come through the mid lane more than that bottom lane. Even Kobbe, it's going to be 2 or 3, probably 3 items before he's fully online. You want the game to be over by that point, so run through the mid lane. And Humanoid, we've seen him set up engages beautifully for Splyce throughout this entire split, so try and neutralize him, try and set him back, and that's going to be a main idea for SK. And the bottom lane, you got to give the advantage to Kobbe. He's been incredible. Again, first team All-Pro. He was voted in the LEC, so excited to see that matchup, but the edge goes to Splyce there, and Splyce should be the favorites in this matchup, but I think it's a lot less than what we saw against Fnatic. I'd go maybe 65-35 for Splyce, but this one, there's no chance it's going to be a sweep. I'm expecting a 5-game set, mainly because Splyce are always playing best of 5s whenever they're in the playoffs, whether they're underdogs or favorites. It seems to always go the distance. 5 out of 8 best of 5 series that they've played in the history of the EU LCS or LEC, they have played 5 of those best of 5s have gone the distance to 5 games. So why would this go any differently? And I think these teams are actually a lot more evenly matched, as we saw in the regular season matchup. So I'm actually more excited for this series than the Fnatic versus Vitality one. But either way, LEC playoffs get going this weekend. So do the LCS ones. We'll preview those very next on the next show. But that's all the time today for League Unlocked. My name's Eric. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next time.